Good afternoon, President, fellows guests. Hadrian's Wall was a major feature in the landscape. It crossed the entire island and was part of an intensely occupied military strip in places up to 2 kilometres wide. Itself sitting within a military zone over 240 kilometres deep. But it was more than that. It was a statement of imperial power, of the ability of a state to impose its will not only on the landscape, but on the people living within it. It is easy to say that it must have had an effect on people living within its shadow and beyond, but more difficult to determine that effect. There are several possible sources of information. Any archaeological evidence provided by the indigenous population, the distribution of Roman artifacts, Roman literary and epigraphic testimonies, Roman military deployment. Unfortunately, the first, any archaeological evidence provided by the indigenous population is, if not mute, might be described as quiet. It is difficult to point to any physical evidence for hostilities within the archaeological databases relating to the peoples within the frontier zone and beyond it. And then, of course, you all know the Desford Carnix as one example of warfare, but it's the quantity or the lack of it that I'm really referring to. Roman artifacts certainly provide evidence for contacts, but not the specific nature of those contacts, which are, of course, open to interpretation. Roman literary sources describe warfare, but can be infuriatingly vague. Agricola certainly fought the Caledonians, but the enemy in Hadrian's reign and in that of Commodus is not named. We can only presume that it is the Caledonians. In 197, it is the Maiartai who are the troublemakers, then defended by the Caledonians, but the Maiartai disappear from history almost as they arrived, leaving only the record that they lived close to the wall that divided the empire in two halves, which wall is not actually stated. We cite place name evidence to suggest that they lived in the region of Stirling from Dunmyat and Myatt Hill in that area. 100 years later, the Picts appear on the scene and remain the stated enemy into the 5th century. It is worth emphasizing that there is no record of the peoples living between the walls or in the hinterland causing any trouble. All the literary evidence we have points to Rome's enemy on the island of Britain being the Caledonians and their successors, the Picts. It is useful to state what we do not have on the northern frontier. The Romans were not coy at recording that buildings had to be restored because of adverse circumstances. For example, in Cyrenaica, modern Libya, owing to the fact that they had been destroyed and burnt down in the Jewish disturbance of 117. The inscriptions state this. In Britain, we have no such record. This is one which records the bathhouse being burnt down in a fire at the fort of Bowes, but it's a bathhouse. I mean, lots of fire around in the bathhouse, so it's not surprising. The burial of a centurion at Vindolanda, killed in a British war in the early 2nd century, is a useful, if rare, corroboration of an event recorded in literature. In seeking an understanding of the northern frontier in Britain, therefore, the nature of military deployment is of considerable value. It formed a deep zone in the 3rd century, stretching for 240 kilometres from the Cheviots to Chester. There are, I suggest, 3 reasons for this. The narrowness of the front line, i.e. Hadrian's Wall, the size of the provincial army, the threat from the north. The narrowness of the Tyne-Solway Isthmus led to troops being spread across the country to the south, as Brian Dobson pointed out 50 years ago. Simply geography. The size of the army presumably related to the threat from the north, but perhaps also to the difficulties of sending reinforcements. And indeed, inertia probably also played a part. Once you have your troops there, it's more trouble to move them rather than leave them. The third element is the threat from the north, and we might expect military deployment along Hadrian's Wall and in its foreland and hinterland to reflect the waxing and waning of that threat. The presence or absence of army units, we might assume, was reflected in the archaeological record, and it is to that which we must turn to learn more about the impact of Rome on the peoples of northern Britain. To start with the wall itself, Plan A, the first plan of Hadrian's, entailed 80 gates at entailed 80 gates at Marcastles and 2 others at special places on the roads north. Thought I'd gone wrong somewhere. A traveller would only have had to walk half a mile to pass through the frontier. This, however, is assuming that the gates were available for civilian use. The necessity for the army to pass through the barrier to engage with an enemy to the north suggests that the gates were primarily provided for the use of the military. It is worth emphasizing that so many gates were unusual for Roman frontiers. Whatever the original intention, it was superseded when the vallum was constructed. This had the effect of restricting movement across the frontier. Now all traffic, whether military or civilian, had to pass under the eyes of the soldiers based at the forts. Here, causeways of earth left across the vallum ditch supported a gate. This is the base of the gate at Benwell. On passing through this gate, we have little evidence for what travellers were expected to do next. They could pass through the fort, perhaps unlikely, walk across the countryside between the vallum and the wall, follow the track beside the wall, or move along the north berm of the vallum where a metal surface has been recorded in several places to then pass through a gap in the north mound and proceed to a Marcastle. This is easier said than done because you can see on the right-hand side all these big blocks at limestone corners still lying on the north berm where orthodoxy would have travellers moving along. We have already reviewed the evidence from other frontiers for admission to the empire. This was possible, but movement in the frontier zone was carefully controlled with permits issued to travellers, while groups had to travel under military escort to specified markets. Since the records of such control stretch from the eastern desert of Egypt to the lower Rhine, we must assume that such control extended as far as the northern frontier of Britain. Who might have been such travellers in North Britain? Farmers moving their livestock, diplomats, refugees, soldiers returning home after service in the army, which we know happened on other frontiers, or traders. There are plentiful references to traders operating outside the empire. This map is just to give you a feel for the fact that although we've got frontiers, which are easy to map, Romans got well beyond these frontiers, and this map is indicating where some Romans actually got to, beyond the empire. Strabo, writing at the time of Augustus, stated that trade existed between southern Britain and the empire. The Britons exported cattle, gold, silver, slaves, and hunting dogs, and received in exchange ivory bracelets and necklaces, amber glassware, and similar petty trifles. It's a bit like, watching a Western, isn't it? And exchange with the indigenous people of America. Tacitus tells us that the interior of Ireland was known through the activities of merchants. The knowledge did not just embrace tribal or state names, but encompassed place names, as you can see. Thus, on a priori grounds, we might expect there to have been Roman traders operating north of the wall. Distribution maps suggest, as we might expect, that most artifacts travel by sea. So far as we can see, few people lived in the highlands, which is why we have a great gap. And if we look at this map, which is a guess at Iron Age settlement, which Graham Ritchie and I prepared 30 years ago now, on the basis of one of Childs, gives you some idea of where people lived, and therefore where you'd expect to find Roman artifacts. The two go together. Elsewhere, nearly every excavated settlement produces at least one object dating to the 2nd century, when the empire extended to the Highland line. Those of the 3rd and 4th centuries are rarer, an issue to which we will return. It is difficult to trace trade in reverse in any detail. Traprain law has produced moulds for dress fasteners, and Lindsay Allison Jones has drawn attention to the number of objects with Celtic antecedents, including terrets, torques, brooches, ring-headed pins, and so-called weaving combs. It is difficult, impossible at present, actually, to know where most of these objects were manufactured, apart from these at Traprain, but Allison Jones has emphasized that the economic hotspot that was Hadrian's Wall is as likely to have drawn in craftsmen and traders from north as much as from south of the border. When we come to look at the direct impact of the construction of the wall on the frontier area, we have a major problem in the lack of excavations of the settlements of the indigenous population and our inability to date closely those sites which have been excavated. One settlement lies between the wall and the vallum at Milking Gap, close to Myrcastle number 38. This was excavated by Kilbride Jones in 1937. The date of its occupation has excited interest over a considerable period. The excavator stated that the pottery, a brooch, and glass bangles all dated to the 2nd century. 3 sherds of pottery were of early 2nd century date, but the excavator doubted that the site was occupied so early. The conclusion was that the settlement was founded after the abandonment of the wall, about 142, when the army moved up to the Antonine Wall, with the extreme possible end of its life being 180. In 1958, John Gillam reviewed the finds and proposed that the life of the settlement ended when the vallum was dug, say in the late 120s, bringing forward the occupation of the site by something like 20 years. It shows you the difficulties we've got. Eric Burley, who had written the original pot report 20 years earlier, at this point reaffirmed his dating, stating that in a wonderful put-down of his own pupil, who was already in his 40s, incidentally, owing to a misunderstanding, Mr. J.P. Gillam has suggested something contrary. What we also need to take into account was the complexity of the settlement. Its growth from an enclosure containing one house in the middle, we might assume this development, to a village of 5 houses, 2 outside the perimeter wall, suggests a longer life than the generation suggested by the original excavator. If the pottery dates to the early to mid-2nd century, this suggests an occupation starting in the late 1st century, if not before, and therefore possibly a settlement forcibly abandoned when the vallum created a military zone. I have spent some time on this one settlement, largely because we have little other evidence for such sites along the wall corridor, but also because even when we do have an approximate date for a site, and all dates have to be approximate, it is not always easy to place it within a wider context. Several other potentially Romano-British settlements have been recognized in the same area on both sides of the wall, and cordrig cultivation, believed to date to the same period, has been recorded, but no other settlement in this narrow corridor has been excavated. Yet plough marks have been identified under nearly every Roman layer from Carabroth. This is my own plan from 1969 excavation there. Yes, I am that old. Have been recorded from Carabroth eastwards as well as in the area of Carlisle. This was a settled farming landscape several millennia old, and it is difficult to imagine that some people were not dispossessed by the building of the wall. It is across this settled landscape, this cultivated landscape, that the Romans drew a line. Now, the Romans were an ordered and legally minded people, and their space had defined borders, whether they were of cities or provinces, and marked by boundary stones. They even had a god of the border. I don't know if any of you are fans of Percy Jackson films, but this is Percy Jackson talking to the god Terminus. Just light relief. The borders of the empire were defined, and the Romans knew when they had crossed into what they called barbaricum. At the same time, they had no inhibitions about operating beyond them. They acted as imperial powers of whatever size do today, interfering in the territory of their neighbours if they wished to do so. In Britain, we can see the military frontier, but we are not sure where the legal frontier lay. The economic and social effect of the border is another issue. The same issue operates today. How far would a motorist drive into another country in order to achieve cheaper petrol? I mean, this is going to be fun in Northern Ireland, isn't it? Or obtain better bread. Now, you might think this is daft, but the Dutch along their border think German bread is better than their bread, so they go into Germany to buy bread. We might regard the distance that you would travel for cheaper cheaper petrol or bread, as one definition of the frontier zone. Did the people of the north pop in and out of the empire to shop, as did those living just beyond the Rhine and the Danube? We should not assume that this did not happen simply because we have no evidence. It is clear that Rome spilled out of the province. Water came to the forts at Halton Chesters and Great Chesters through aqueducts, tapping streams to the north of the wall. Quarrying for stone took place north of the wall. At war's end, space was so limited south of the wall that occupation spread to the north of the barrier, and possible civilian buildings of the extramural settlements have also been recorded north of the wall at Chesters and Bodosdon, and we are finding them now quite regularly. North of Newcastle, the Green Square, fields have been identified, as they have been identified on the Antonine Wall beyond the barrier. In Newcastle, several numbers of abraded sherds hint at manuring with refuse from the adjacent fort and settlement, though we must not ignore the possibility of pre-Roman creation of these fields in view of the strong evidence for early agriculture along the wall, though clearly they remained in use in the Roman period. So we must accept that the first plan for the wall had a direct effect on the people living in its shadow. We might expect that the concentration of 24 forts in the frontier zone as part of Plan B, Hadrian's revised plan, would have had a more intense effect. There were many more thousands of mouths now to feed, and the army liked to obtain as many as possible of its supplies locally. It may be for that reason that many forts were placed in areas of good farmland, though this, of course, is also where the people lived, who you might want to control. The existence of the army is also likely to have stimulated the settlements recently recognized south of the wall in County Durham, quite substantial places of the size of villages. There is also significant new evidence from north of the wall. Several settlements of prehistoric and Roman date have been examined between the northern outskirts of Newcastle and Morpeth. Occupation began at some in the Late Bronze Age, continuing into the Roman period. Early settlements were unenclosed, but around 400 to 200 BC, settlements were more usually enclosed, as occurred elsewhere between the Tees and the Forth. Hodgson has drawn attention to the close and consistent spacing of contemporary sites in the landscape. This was an intensively farmed landscape. Wheat and barley were cultivated, evidence for cattle, sheep or goats, and pig were recorded, together with horses. To the north of the wall at Peg's Wood, an unenclosed farmstead settlement was established again in about 400 BC at Peg's Wood. This was succeeded by a larger settlement, which would merit the description of a village surrounded by a network of extensive enclosures. There are areas for habitation, storage, manufacturing, and processing, with enclosures for stock and a lane or drove road, which you can see here. The dating evidence indicates that all these settlements, the early settlements, starting off 400 BC, that is, all these were abandoned in the late 1st century and early 2nd century AD. The village at Pegswood being replaced by a large timber enclosure, which you see there, top left, and a substantial field boundary already mentioned. In his careful analysis of the evidence, Hodgson has offered several possible explanations. He argued that depopulation through military recruitment, a proposition in favour 50 years ago, seems unlikely, as does transfer into slavery. These actions might have taken place when the area was conquered, but not 2 generations later. Another possible reason offered by Hodgson was deliberate clearance of the area in front of the wall. We have already touched on the treaties on the lower Danube in the 170s, whereby the Romans sought to control the occupation of the zone to the north of the river and largely failed, as the treaties demonstrate. 100 years before, Tacitus commented on uninhabited land across the lower Rhine retained for the use of the army, which the locals demanded to be able to use and failed. Hodgson's tentative conclusion was that the Romans in Britain cleared settlements from a wide zone in front of the wall. A more positive view of the evidence offered by Hodgson as well, and before him, Jenny Proctor, on the basis of her excavations at Peg's Wood, is that the abandonment of the settlements and the creation of a substantial field boundary, which you see here still, part of a possible stock enclosure on an entirely different alignment may have reflected a response to the prodigious requirements of the Roman army, not least for cattle, but horses, obviously. And do you know how many goats it went into making a Roman tent? 38. Multiply that up, and you'll see the prodigious requirements. On the West Coast, one project has allowed a more in-depth view of what might have been happening to the north of the wall to the west. Roger Mercer recently published the report on his excavation at Castle Orr in Overig, which I think you can buy just outside, actually, in the valley of the River Esk, some 30 kilometres north of Bowness-on-Solway. 2 sites in a densely settled landscape, as the early material in the Northumberland Plain. Mercer offered a detailed discussion of the requirements of the army for cattle to be used not only for meat, but leather and horn, and related these to the size of the army on the wall and the realities of supply, arguing that supplies would be most likely to have been obtained locally. He concluded that the annexes at Castle Orr may have been pens for cattle and or ponies bred for sale to the Roman army. Sale is an important word. We do know that the Roman army actually bought horses, and we have the records of this from the East. This conclusion, and that of Proctor, to the east fits well with the approach taken by Sue Stallybrass. Stallybrass has drawn attention to the preponderance of cattle bones on the sites of the military community. The skeletal element in the collections implies that the animals arrived on the hoof. She noted that the requirements of the army in the war's hinterland may have resulted in a lack of surplus for export to the frontier forts, and that the densely occupied agricultural land of southern Britain was better suited to growing crops, some of which we know were exported to the continental armies. Stallybrass observed that the area between the two walls is an area of upland that is well suited to cattle and sheep farming, and asked whether this could have been an additional production area for military meat supplies. In seeking to answer the question, Stallybrass cited as comparison the droving of cattle south from Scotland to southern markets from the 1660s through to the middle of the 19th century. She also cited the reference by Pliny the Elder to geese being driven to Rome from northern Italy as an example of such practice from the Roman period. Stallybrass acknowledged the lack of evidence from Britain. She did, however, point to the existence of the outpost forts to the north of the western end of the wall and asked whether they might have played a part in droving, not least as Bewcastle was on a post-medieval droving route. She also noted the suggestion of Bill Hanson that in the late 1st century the compounds at Elgin Hoch were used as collection points for animals. Isotope analysis may provide an answer to the question proposed by Stallybrass. In the meantime, we can see that theory and field excavations are on a similar trajectory. We have so far been considering a relatively narrow strip of land north of Hadrian's Wall. If we broaden our horizons, we can acknowledge that one archaeological characteristic of all the land up to the 4th is our inability to recognize all but a few of the 3rd and 4th century settlements. The wide social spread of artifacts in the 2nd century has gone, and most 3rd and 4th century material is found on hill forts such as Traprain Law, Eildon Hill North, Edinburgh Castle Rock, and Dumbarton Rock. There is material elsewhere, for example in Tweeddale and at Hucko in the Wansbeck Valley, closer to the wall. Here sherds from at least 5 vessels of late 3rd to 4th century date were recovered. The fact that Roman pottery could reach some sites emphasizes its absence elsewhere. Fraser Hunter has noted a link between the quality Roman objects and the social hierarchy. Perhaps Hucko falls into the same category with its 3rd and 4th century pottery. While reporting on the pottery from the settlement at Crosby Garrett, some 50 kilometres that is, south of the wall in modern Cumbria, Paul Bidwell drew a parallel between this late 3rd and 4th century pottery at Crosby Garrett and the material at Hucko. The point is, Crosby Garrett settlement is where the Roman sports helmet was found. On anyone's calculation, this settlement was of some significance and heightens our appreciation of the significance of Hucko. The duration of Plan C, which this map relates to, but only north of Hadrian's Wall. This is the one that started in the late 2nd century. The duration of Plan C is important to assessing the impact of Rome. Now, there were major bases north of the wall, evidence for operations beyond the Cheviots through a physical military presence, the existence of the scouts, cavalry backup, together with the treaties and the subsidies, all revealing how the northern frontier was controlled. In trying to assess Rome's impact on the northern frontier, we should ignore Hadrian's Wall. Never thought I'd hear myself say that. It was not the frontier now, and the paucity of Roman material in the land between the Tyne and the Forth cannot be put down to its situation beyond the frontier, for at least part of it did lie within the province and the remainder in its shadow. So the purple line for me is a guess at where the frontier roughly was, and the blue line is the area in its shadow. The transformation in the landscape in Northumberland occurred within the province. That was this area. Beyond it lay a zone of impact to as far north as the Forth and probably beyond. Within this zone, the lack of Roman artifacts in rural settlements from the 180s onwards can potentially be explained by the widespread change in farming practices identified on the Northumberland plain in response to the Roman army's voracious appetite. If we accept the evidence of meeting places north of the wall, the stars, which go right up to the Tay, this zone of Roman influence does stretch as far as the Tay, the cultural divide between northern and southern Scotland. I was just having fun with PowerPoint, but it does really, I think, make the point what we really should be thinking in terms of the province up to the Cheviots, this great zone in the shadow of the empire, and then beyond it, these treaty relationships. The change in farming practices appears not only to have swept away farmsteads, but I suggest may have focused economic power into fewer hands. Those are the people whose settlements have produced 3rd and 4th century pottery and artifacts. The social elite, perhaps simply the entrepreneurs. The former farmers are likely to have lost not only their farms, but their position in society. Compare the clearances and the enclosures in the 18th, 19th centuries. It may be that they lost their interest in Roman objects, but I think this is probably too simplistic a proposition. The Wroxeter Environs project in the Northwest Midlands has demonstrated that the people of its countryside were much less interested in the material culture of Rome, especially away from the road network, i.e. the further you get from the town into the countryside, the fewer Roman artifacts you find on settlements. And this is reflected also to an extent in East Yorkshire. The lack of Roman material culture on Roman sites has sometimes been interpreted as indicating a rejection of Rome. But we should be cautious of this model. Other explanations are possible. The poor material culture of rural settlements in the lower Rhineland has been explained by Carol van Driel Murray as relating to the absence of local men on service in the Roman army. They provided the emperor's bodyguard in Rome, and the survival of their women folk within a subsistence economy with no money to buy Roman goods. In other words, the lack of Roman artifacts was not a conscious decision, but an enforced one. What we can say is that the local people were sucked into the new entrepreneurial lifestyle of the frontier region in the northern shadow of Hadrian's Wall. They may also, of course, have been sucked into the Roman taxation system. This was based on the census, such as carried out by Hatterius Nepos within the territory of the Annavonensian Britons, presumably Annandale. Taxes in the Roman world were normally paid in cash, but the poorer tribes of the frontier region could pay in kind, as did the Frisi north of the Rhine and the Batavians of the Rhine Delta. The former in ox hides, the latter in recruits to the army. As the Roman army sought to source its supplies locally, we should be aware of that potential symbiotic relationship. It was, of course, not just the army that required feeding. In a memorable phrase, Lindsay Allison-Jones likened the appearance of Hadrian's Wall in the landscape with its enormous garrison and trail of civilians to the equivalent of the Klondike. People were attracted to this northwest frontier from as far away as Palmyra on the eastern frontier and Mauritania to the south. The existence of extramural settlements has long been recognized. This is the fort at Maryport, and you can see that the extramural settlement is larger than the fort. Excavations have been few in number, but our knowledge of the environs of forts was completely revolutionized through the geophysical surveys of Alan Biggins and David Taylor of Timescape in particular. Extensive remains were planned, spreading over a wider area than the fort. In the main, the buildings, this is Oxford Archaeology North's excavation of Maryport, the buildings, mostly strip houses, within these extramural settlements, lay to both sides of the roads leading east and west from the fort gates. Some, such as those outside the south gate of Housesteads, appear to be shops. Here also a workshop and shrines have been recognized, and also, of course, temples are known outside several forts. Granaries have been identified, presumably for the civilian community, and some of the larger buildings may have served as storehouses. Literary sources include merchants, priests, craftsmen, publicans, and prostitutes as members of the military community. At Bird Oswald, a long, wide, triangular open space has been identified as a possible marketplace. The geophysical surveys reveal stone buildings, but these would have required timber for roofs and remind us of another major requirement to which we can add firewood, of which we know absolutely nothing. We know, indeed, nothing of the effect of these major requirements for timber in the countryside, on the countryside around forts and their extramural settlements. The plans are wonderful, but the buildings they record are mostly undated. Little, too, is known about the inhabitants of the buildings. Inscriptions are one source of information, but these are restricted in the information they provide, as most are tombstones of the wives, children, and other relatives of soldiers, including mother-in-laws, members of the wider military community. Two inscriptions reveal that the people of Housesteads and Vindolanda had acquired self-governing rights. Here outlined in red is the Vicani Vindolandenses. In seeking to determine the nature and status of the people living in the extramural settlement, we should acknowledge that the Roman army, even on campaign, was accompanied by camp followers. Caesar makes clear that these were excluded from the military compound, the camp, unless the situation deteriorated seriously. Such camp followers would have accompanied the soldiers when they moved to permanent bases. And when the regiment moved on, so did the camp followers. There was no point in them staying outside the abandoned fort. There was simply nothing there for them. There is an interesting inscription in Spain recording that the Emperor Vespasian allowed a community moving from their oppidum to a new site on the plain to take their privileges with them. The point is that the privileges related to the people, not to the place. We can see, therefore, that a new regiment arriving on Hadrian's Wall would have been accompanied by the wider military community, followers probably already in possession of a certificate of privileges. We have tended to assume in the past that many inhabitants of the extramural settlements, and indeed recruits for the army, came from the surrounding countryside, and perhaps some did. But the army itself travelled with its own civil community and its own ready source of recruits, the sons of soldiers. If country boys were recruited for service in the Roman army, they certainly did not send souvenirs home to their mums, as the paucity of Roman material on rural farmsteads demonstrates. The heyday of the extramural settlements at forts appears to have been the 2nd century and on to the late 3rd century. Sometimes towards the end of that century, what we perceived through geophysical surveys as thriving communities came to an end. Coin sequences and pottery end in or about the early 270s at some 16 known extramural settlements in the frontier zone, on the wall, behind the wall. The situation is particularly interesting at South Shields. Here there is a suggestion that at least in one area, buildings in the extramural settlement were systematically dismantled. Later 3rd and 4th century coins and small quantities of 4th century pottery were recovered from all the larger areas excavated, but in each case by this stage the land had been given over to agricultural activities. The abandonment of civil settlements on the frontier, Hadrian's Wall, in the late 3rd century can be paralleled at several sites on the Middle Danube, both legionary and auxiliary, from Vienna to Mercer. At Brigatio, which is the top left, where coins Samian and Amphora end in the middle of the 3rd century, Linda Debussy has used almost the same word, systematic abandonment, as at South Shields, to describe the situation. In this case, however, Debussy has concluded that the inhabitants simply abandoned their homes. They walked out. We appear to have a phenomenon which is not unique to Britain, and therefore we must consider our evidence in a wider context. The 50 years from 235, the death of the Emperor Severus Alexander, to the accession of Diocletian in 284, were turbulent, with civil wars and invasions a constant theme. That was Brigatio abandoned. As we have seen, in the 260s, Dacia north of the Danube was abandoned, as was the land between the upper reaches of the Rhine and the Danube, followed by southern Mauritania, Tingitana, in the 280s. There are several possible reasons for the abandonment of settlements outside forts at about the same time. Pressures on the frontier may have led to the civilians moving inside the forts. The withdrawal of troops from the frontier forts to serve in the field armies, newly invented, would have led to a crisis in the extramural settlements, with fewer soldiers with families, fewer soldiers to service, and fewer mouths to feed. The economic crisis of the 3rd century led to a decline in the spending power of the individual soldier and the introduction of payment in kind. This would have led to less money being available to buy goods from traders in the civil settlement, and possibly soldiers having to give up their slaves, for example, but not to the abandonment of families, we may presume. Well, let us stand back. What might cause the wholesale abandonment of a settlement, and indeed settlements? Kyle Harper has recently written about the little-known pandemic of the 250s and 260s. This is first attested in Egypt in 249 and appears to have continued until at least 270. The disease, whatever it was, and we cannot name it, struck quickly and was very contagious. It resulted in diarrhea and vomiting. I do apologize, it's Sunday afternoon. Diarrhea and vomiting, internal pain, putrefaction of the limbs, blindness was recorded, and a heavy thirst. The plague was attested in urban areas, cities and villages, and in the army in the 250s. It is recorded that whole villages were simply wiped out. While we have no evidence for the pandemic in the northwest provinces of the empire, Illyricum, where it is recorded, which is that dot, is adjacent to Upper Pannonia, where some civil settlements outside forts came to an end in the 270s, including Mersa, today's Osijek, in Croatia. The army, of course, would have been an excellent vector of disease. Such a catastrophe affecting the frontier in Britain is at least worthy of consideration. Whatever the reason for the end of civil settlements in Britain, if the soldiers had survived in their forts, and we see no reason to believe that this did not happen, though numbers were smaller, then there were women and children somewhere close. What can we make of the evidence from Britain? In 1980, Charles Daniels, following his own excavations at Wallsend, during which he examined a considerable part of the fort and traced its history, offered an explanation for the striking change in the planning of the fort from the 2nd and 3rd centuries into the 4th. He suggested the reason was that the regiment at Wallsend, together with others on the frontier, had been withdrawn from service in southern Britain and departed accompanied by their families, and that when they returned, men, women, and children all moved into the forts, each family occupying one of the new style barrack blocks known as chalets, which you see here. Unfortunately, we have no evidence to determine whether this model has any validity. In fact, in the final report on Daniel's excavation, it is stated that little evidence for the presence of females was found in the fort except in the commanding officer's house. Daniels was basing his premise on the assumption that the chalet barracks were introduced into the forts of northern Britain sometime around 300. That would fit his dating. The discovery of chalets at Vindolanda by Paul Bidwell challenged that interpretation, for these were dated about 60 years earlier and 40 years before the purported abandonment of the extramural settlements. Artifacts were brought into the discussion to help determine whether there was any evidence for civilians inside forts. In her report on the small finds from Housesteads, the excavation's top right, Lindsay Allison-Jones noted that no unequivocal human objects were found in the chalets in the northeast corner of the fort, but they were found in the centurions, the officers' quarters. So the officer could have wife and family, and we know they were married. Soldiers apparently did not have women there, according to the archaeological evidence. The story at Vindolanda, however, appears to be different. The extensive excavations here have allowed detailed analysis of the artifacts found in both the fort and the extramural settlement. There is a striking change in the distribution of loom weights, spindle whorls, beads, bracelets, and hairpins, all objects with civilian connotations, I think. Difficult to know these days, isn't it? Distribution between the 3rd and the 4th centuries. So what we've got left is a 3rd century distribution where you can see all these finds are mainly outside, and in the 4th century, they're mainly inside. For each, in his review of the evidence, Andrew Burley acknowledges that the barracks may have been cleaned more thoroughly in the 3rd century, resulting in fewer female artifacts found within the fort. He concluded that women did live in the fort in the 3rd century, but the total number of adult women there increased substantially in the 4th. What is equally interesting is the distribution of military equipment. In the 3rd century, excavation of the civil settlement yielded more slingshot, scabbard fittings, shield bosses and shield fittings and fragments of armour than the fort. We have to be careful how we interpret our evidence. Burley concluded that the fort walls at 3rd century Vindolanda did not constitute a great divide, and we should be aware of using simple contrasting terms such as civilian or military when describing the occupation within an extramural settlement or a fort. We must consider the possibility that a more fluid pattern existed. This is part of a pattern emerging across the empire, with evidence for civilians being identified within forts, for example at Vindonissa in Switzerland, where have been identified a bar and an inn within the walls of the legionary fortress, with women working and possibly even living within it. The different stories at Housesteads and Vindolanda are part of a wider pattern of differences between forts along the wall. Chalet-style barrack blocks have been recognised at some 7 forts in the north, but they are often different from each other. Daniels identified 10 different types of late barracks with striking differences even within the same fort. The relative uniformity of planning recognisable in the 2nd century barracks seems to have ended. Further, the chalet style of barrack has not been found in every fort, not at Carlisle, nor at South Shields, for example. In such circumstances, it is difficult to produce a single interpretation which fits all the evidence. There are many other changes in the 4th century, in the planning of forts as well as to individual buildings such as granaries and headquarters buildings. At South Shields, a large courtyard house was erected in one corner of the fort rather than in the traditional location in the central range. These changes all relate to the use of individual buildings in forts, and they appear to reflect different actions. This is the reconstruction of South Shields. This point was made by Lucian Roche. The lack of standardization suggests that the modifications did not stem from a refurbishment drive dictated by Rome. Rather, they seem to reflect ad hoc maintenance and responses to the changing needs of individual forts. We have come a long way from the straitjacket of the wall periods. We now don't even have regionalization. We have truly moved to a position whereby the history of each fort has to be judged on its own evidence. The old certainties have disappeared. The interiors of forts varied with implications for how they were used, and we have only excavated a tiny proportion. It is more difficult than before to extrapolate from an excavation in one part of a fort to the rest, or from one fort to another. Can we put anything together to make a viable model? I'm not altogether sure that we can. There are simply too many imponderables. So what can we say? There seems to be good evidence the extramural settlements were abandoned in the late 3rd century, the 270s being the crucial decade. Maryport abandoned in the 270s. This was part of a wider phenomenon. There is disagreement about where their occupants went. The lack of evidence for female-style artifacts in the men's quarters at Housesteads, which I've skipped over, argues against the movement of women and children into the barracks at that fort. The evidence from Vindolanda, just 3 kilometres distant, is in direct contrast. It has been suggested that some civilians drifted to the towns of the frontier regions, but we have no evidence for this. But whatever happened, If soldiers survived on the wall, and it appears that they did, there would be somewhere close there womenfolk, traders, thieves, vagabonds, and all the other people, undesirables, as Collingwood put them, who lived off and with the army. We simply cannot see them yet. And when we look at the size of the extramural settlements along the wall, as revealed by geophysical survey, these are large number of people to have disappeared. Or are they lurking in parts of these settlements that we have not yet examined? Which is why the fact that there are as many as 16 extramural settlements known to be abandoned at this time is important. It is something of an irony that while archaeologists have been grappling with the implications of the abandonment of extramural settlements, a new phenomenon should have been recognized in Hadrian's Wall forts, the marketplace. This was first proposed as the interpretation of the cluster of small coins at the junction of the two main roads in front of the headquarters building in the fort at Newcastle. The coins ranged from about 270 through to about 360, with a concentration in the 340s and the 350s. The conclusion was that the casual loss of large numbers of coins seems best explained by money changing hands in some form of market. A similar situation was recognized at Carlisle, where the range of coins found in the same location in that fort was very similar to that at Newcastle. At Wallsend, a concentration of 4th century coins was found in the area of the passageway through the minor west gate and the immediately adjacent area of the Intervallum Street to the north, with the conclusion that these represented some form of marketing. Hodgson emphasized that the area was restricted in size and may have been where individual traders or peddlers arrived to sell their wares. At Vindolanda, there is an old record of nearly 300 coins of the same date being found inside the main west gate of the fort. We have always assumed that traders in early centuries lived in the extramural settlements, not just because it appears to be so obvious, but also because we have literary evidence for merchants being amongst the army's camp followers. On the other hand, a letter from a soldier in Syria stated that merchants came to his fort every day. Peripatetic merchants. We might envisage that some traders were indeed peripatetic on the northern frontier, constantly moving around the military landscape of Hadrian's Wall. They would need to collect items to sell, and they need to collect their items to sell to the soldiers, and the obvious places to serve as supply points will be the towns of Corbridge and Carlisle, as well as South Shields at the mouth of the Tyne, possibly even Maryport on the west coast. The Vindolanda writing tablets 200 years earlier demonstrated that Catterick was also an important supply point. While there appear to have been marketplaces at 4 frontier forts in the middle of the 4th century, other sites have not yielded such evidence. Perhaps we have been looking in the wrong place. An obvious location for a market outside a fort would be beside the port gate at the top of Stagshaw Bank, just close to Halton Chesters, which was the location of a famous fair in the Middle Ages. Is it coincidental that the latest coins from Hadrian's Wall were found close to here at Great Whittington? At least they hint at a relationship between the Romans on the wall and those of the states to the north. John Mann denied such a relationship, pointing to the absence of Roman pottery of the late 4th century, so abundant within the province, and also coins, and concluded that the peoples of southern Scotland at this time, the late 4th century, were not friendly to Rome. This was part of his wider challenge to Richmond's 1940 hypothesis that Rome created buffer states to the north of the wall in the aftermath of the barbarian conspiracy of 367 with the purpose of defending the province. Richmond based his interpretation on the supposed Roman names of the early kings of the states of the Scottish lowlands, some of which marked here, which Richmond saw as representing Roman investment of authority. These names of the early kings of these states included Pattern Pesrut, translated by Richmond as Paternus of the Red Cloak. He was invested with his red cloak by the Roman authorities. Unfortunately, Pesrut means red shirt, not red cloak, and as John Peter Wilde has pointed out, red was a common dye at Vindolanda. If any colour was going to be used for investiture, it would have been purple, in the manner of the tunic given to Clovis on receiving an honorary consulship. Earlier than this, Kenneth Jackson had challenged the Richmond model, pointing out the unreliability of the source material, the early medieval genealogies. This statement by the expert of the period was dismissed by Richmond as a conservative view. Mann's interpretation of the Roman-style names was that they reflected conversion to Christianity, the Roman religion, thereby leading to the adoption of Roman names. In short, we can conclude that Richmond's hypothesis has no foundation. As always, at the end of the northern frontier, we are left with Traprain law. The coin series here runs to the very end of the 4th century, the date of the treasure, and there are some fragments of late glass vessels. While in the past the Traprain treasure was seen as loot, today's interpretation is that it was a payment to one of Rome's neighbours to maintain their friendliness. We need to see this scenario in relationship to the problems with the Picts, which continued at least to the end of the 4th century. It was also a method used elsewhere in these islands, as indicated by the Coleraine hoard in Ireland, where 2 of Rome's enemies lived, the Scots and the Atticotai. Not always enemies, because we know of 2 regiments of Atticotai in the Roman army. In some ways, Traprain law and Coleraine are the perfect end to Roman Britain. They reflect Rome's continuing policy of seeking to succor friends and influence people beyond their borders in order to maintain peace on the frontier. They are an integral part of Plan E for Hadrian's Wall, but more than that, they acknowledge the continuation of Rome's grand strategy for its northern frontier in Britain. It is to research strategies that I will turn in my final lecture. Thank you.